Hello, today we're going to focus on Chapter 11, which focuses on professional commitment and employment. So let's talk about some definitions. First of all, let's talk about professionalism. A profession is a group of individuals whose work is predominantly intellectual in character. And so it requires a lot of thought, reflection, a lot of skill development, concept development, understanding of theory and research. And this is all required in early childhood and child development. And constant decisions that call for discretion and judgment must be made. For example, making sure we keep information we learn about families and children private and confidential. And so we want to make sure that we're exhibiting professionalism, and we focused on that in the beginning of the semester when we talked about the ethical code of conduct. Also, being part of a profession means that there has to be professional development or continued learning going on. And some components of that are continually increasing your education, maybe providing credentials. And in California, a credential is issued for elementary and secondary ed. And this requires a bachelor's degree with postgraduate work. Certificates can be provided for professional development hours, but also community colleges award certificates of achievement in different areas. For example, at Rio Hondo, we have one in child development. We have another one in special education. If you take our child growth and development and principles and practices, and then our 226, which is Introduction to Special Ed, and 232, which is Educating Children with Special Needs, you can earn a Special Education Certificate of Achievement. We also have one of those in Infant Toddler, which includes the 211, which is Infant Toddler Development, and 213, which is Infant Toddler Curriculum. And we have one in language and literacy. The two classes for that is 120, CD 120, which is language experiences in language arts, and then 229, which is literacy development. We also have a preschool teacher certificate, which covers the requirements for licensing, which is 106, child growth and development, 110, Principles and Practices in ECE, 111, ECE Curriculum, 208, which is Child, Family, and Community, and then CD 102, which is Nutrition, Health, and Safety. In California, when it comes to licensing, licenses are provided to private, for-profit, or non-profit centers, but not to individuals. This will differ in different states. Also, we didn't include in these components, and the chapter doesn't talk about degrees. And at Rio Hondo, we have a transfer degree. And a transfer degree is more like an associate's degree, and then we also have an associate's degree. And then training that you might do, like going to conferences and seminars and presentations and professional growth meetings. So some of the barriers in early childhood and child development are just the public's perception of the field. Some in the public believe that everyone was a child once, so anyone can work with children. It doesn't require training or skills. We know that's not the case, because the more you learn about children, the more you realize you need to learn more. And in California, part of the problem with this is we have two siloed systems that makes it complicated. One system is under the Department of Social Services, and this covers private for-profit and nonprofit centers. And the other one is through the Department of Ed, which covers publicly funded programs. And so if you're working for publicly funded programs, the educational requirements are higher than if you're working for a private, for-profit, or nonprofit program. And so that influences the public perception too. Generally, if you're working for public education, for example, in elementary school, you have to have a credential, whereas if you're working in a private, for-profit, or nonprofit, you don't even have to have a child development permit. If you're working for publicly funded programs, these are Title V programs, and they do require an associate's or a permit, a child development permit, which sometimes requires an associate degree. And we'll talk more about those specifically. Sometimes those who work in child development or early childhood field, they choose to work with children because they may not feel confident working with adults. And because of that lack of confidence, they might have lower self-esteem and might be less assertive. And so that reflects on the profession as a whole. Also, early childhood and child development are more service-oriented, and the focus is not so much on the financial components of it. And then oftentimes there's a lack of bargaining power, and this comes from not being members of a union. And then there's less political clout because of that. And so we're not saying necessarily that we should be part of a union, but it makes you have more credibility when it comes to bargaining for benefits and salaries. Because of these barriers, we have a high turnover rate, and because of those two silos, Department of Social Services versus Department of Ed, in the Department of Social Services area, there's low entry-level requirements and there's lower salary because you don't have to have as much training. So in regards to professional behavior and commitment then, advocacy is a way we can combat the barriers and increase our assertiveness and self-esteem. And so the ways that we can advocate for our field and for the children and families we serve can be to become informed regarding the process of legislation and of advocating for children and families, stay up to date with legislative actions and groups that can support the field, and communicate clear messages and plans to those who have power and control over what happens to the legislative process and the funding. And then also we want to make sure that we follow up and be persistent. And that shouldn't be flow up, it should be follow up and be persistent. Advocacy influences our employment opportunities, our salaries, our benefits, and not just issues related to the workforce, but the availability of quality programs for children. And so we all must participate in advocacy. And so here are some groups that advocate on the national arena. For example, the American Associate Degree in Early Childhood Educators, the International Reading Association, the National Association for Bilingual Education, A national program that's very active in California is 0 to 3. They have a really strong advocacy program in the state of California. And when it comes to California itself, there are several California-based advocacy companies or groups. There's Californians for Quality Early Learning, and these are focused on licensed centers in California, and you have the web address for that group. We have Every Child California, and this is focused on publicly funded centers in California. And this is California Child Development Administrators Association. This is what it used to be called, CCDAA. We also have CAPA, which is the California Alternative Payments Program Association, and this is focused on organizations participating in the alternative payment program for CalWORKs families. And then California Child Care Resource and Referral Network, and this is focused on federally funded resource and referral programs. And resource and referral programs provide a database of the different programs that provide services for children, whether it be licensed or family child care. They often have lists for them, and then also for Title V programs. Resource and referral is funded by the Child Development Block Grant through federal government. They also provide training for teachers and parents and families as well. So when we talk about professional development, there are really 3 stages of professional development, particularly for teachers in the classroom. When you first start in a program, you really are going through a period of survival, and it's very much like what you faced when you first started taking the practicum class. You're just learning about the roles and responsibilities of being a teacher, and figuring out how you can balance the work that needs to be done to fulfill those roles. After about 2 or 3 years, you're in a stage of consolidation where you've figured things out and things become a bit easier, and you can make things become more efficient and maybe expand on your skills. And then the third stage probably comes at about 5 or 6 years working as a teacher. You start to feel like you're more of an expert in that area and more mature. And this might be a time when you want to reach out and mentor others who are new to the field. And then in regards to professional development, the California Child Development Permit requires us, if we have one of those, and we'll talk about that a bit later, it requires us to put in 105 hours of professional growth within 5 years to renew that permit. And so that averages out to about 21 hours a year of professional growth. And so what can you do to get that professional growth? Those professional growth hours, you can take college courses, but you can't only take college courses. You have to pick 3 different areas where you get your professional growth hours from. You could go to conferences and workshops also. You could fulfill leadership roles in groups like NAEYC, the National Association for the Education of Young Children. We've mentioned this before. That's where our ethical code of conduct came from, and that developmentally appropriate practice book that you're doing your summaries from. You could also be a leader in the California Association for the Education of Young Children as well. In my career, I've been a president of a local affiliate. I've been the newsletter person. When we used to do printed newspapers, newsletters we sent in the mail. I was a Week of the Young Child organizer as part of that Association for the Education of Young Children. You can also be a professional growth advisor to help verify the professional growth of others. And by the way, your supervising teachers can fulfill that role. I can fulfill that role too, but I only do it in emergencies. If somebody is desperate and needs a professional growth advisor. You could also improve your basic skills, like learning more about computers or math. And then you can also utilize your CPR and first aid courses as well. And so when we talk about employment in the child development field, we could provide direct services to children at centers, as specialized educators in kindergarten and primary and secondary schools, in infant toddler care, in family child care, in after school or before school programs, and of course preschools. You could also provide direct services to families. You could be a home visitor for Head Start. You could work as a pediatrician, starting out by taking child development classes. You could provide parent education. And by the way, this table is on page 293 of your textbook. You could also provide indirect services to children, families, and educators. You could work for our community care licensing agency and be a licensing analyst. And by the way, we need more and more people to work for them instead of having public safety or public health people. We should have people trained in early childhood. You could be a consultant in early childhood. You could be an administrator and provide support services. You could be a board and advisory bodies. You could be a director. You could be also work in community and social services, be a child advocate, work for Parks and Rec. You could also work for you could work as part of a consultant or department head or advisor. And these are all on page 294 of your book. And so this table on page 296, this one gives you more of who might hire you in the public arena or the private arena. And then this tells you the characteristics of those groups. So then if you're looking for employment in child development or early childhood, here's some advice as far as finding a job. The first thing you want to do is make sure you know your field and its components. So you want to make sure that you know that in California we only license centers and programs, not people, and that you may need a child development permit to apply for a position. And again, we're going to talk more specifically about permits later on. Or for a credential, you would need that to teach in elementary school or in secondary schools. So it's really important that you know the difference, because if you completed your education at a community college, you don't qualify for a credential. And so if you go to apply for a job with your associate degree, you're not going to want to say, I have a credential, because you don't. You would have to have a bachelor's plus postgraduate work, but you may have a permit, and you don't want to mix the child development permit up with the credential, because that doesn't send positive message to your possible employer that you know your field well and you'll be a well-informed employee. When you're filling out an application, you want to make sure that you remember that this is the first impression of that potential employer has in regards to you. So you want to make sure you fill it out using complete sentences and accurate grammar and spelling, and you want to put a lot of thought into your answers and make sure that you're sending a message to them that you're well-informed, educated in theory, research, and educational philosophies, that you're reflective, that you care about children and families, and you're going to be a good employee for them. Before the interview, you want to make sure that you find out what you can about the employer. So today, everybody has a web page with all kind of information about their policies and procedures, their mission, their philosophy, what special programs they have, like maybe they're a state preschool program. And so you want to make sure that you can become as informed as possible, because employers expect you, if you want to work for them, to find out this information and reflect it in your interview. And in the interview, you must sell the interviewers on your knowledge and skills, just like you did in your application. In the interview, even if they know you, most often they can't judge you on what they know before you come to that interview. You have to sell them in the interview. They will ask you questions about principles of the field and practices. They'll ask you how would you deal with inappropriate behavior. They're going to ask you about curriculum and educational philosophies. And then they're always going to ask you questions about interacting with parents. So make sure before you go to an interview, you review best practices, how to teach appropriate behavior. You review your theories and educational philosophies, and you have a great summary sheet on developmental theories and on the major educational philosophies. And then you also want to think about staff and parent interactions.